Thank you everyone for joining. As promised, every month we come up with something exciting. I think this session is really cool because I've personally used a lot of scripts and script generating tools that Merill has written. It's really awesome, really handy. He's one of our program managers in our GTP team, and he's very well known in the community. I'm so glad to have you, Merill. And also, he's joining us from Australia, which is really an odd time right now. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. So thanks a lot for joining, Merill, at this time.
No worries, Nandeesh. I'm really happy to join the call. So it's the first time I'm joining the identity community call. So really excited to be here.
Awesome. So as always, there are some ground rules that we wanted to set. Let's be respectful. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat window. You can just mention at the name Nandeesh or Merill and put in your question. We'll try to answer that in the chat. If not, we'll try to take it at the end of the call. I will be sharing a survey in the call while the call is going on. We would really love to get details of how do you think we should do our next session, what should we do, and how did this current call go, and all those things. So we record these calls and we put it on our YouTube channel, which I've already shared in the chat window. You can just go to that channel and check out our videos that we have done before. You can follow me on LinkedIn to get updates about such calls, events, programs similar to these. Go to LinkedIn and follow me at Nandeesh Swami. You can also follow us on Twitter at Microsoft 365 Dev and Azure AD. Will be sharing updates about our events, programs, as well as products. Like always, we do this call every third Thursday of the month. The next one is coming up on February 16th.
Perfect. So quick intro about myself. My name is Merill Fernando. I'm a senior product manager in the Azure Active Directory team. In my day job, I help some of our large enterprise customers deploy Azure Active Directory. And in my past life, I used to be a developer. So I try to combine all the dev stuff with identity, and Graph is one of my passion areas, Microsoft Graph and Graph PowerShell. So I wanted to share some of these things with you folks. I'm not sure why, but my presentation seems to be running on its own. So we'll just get started onto the first tip itself. So I thought let's go back to basics. So the first tip is the Microsoft 365 Dev Tenant. It's a free tenant and you get all of the licenses, and it looks like every time we share this, new people find out about it. So this is sort of like the first tip at the moment. So let me show you what that is, right? So that's not what's meant to happen. Okay, so right now there seems to be a bug with Edge where it's not allowing you to create a new tenant when you're on Edge, but Chrome works for some reason. So if you search for M365 Dev, you will see the developer program page, and you'll be able to click the Join Now button. Now you need to sign in with your any Microsoft account. Don't use your work account, but if you use your Microsoft account, you will be given the option to create a dev sandbox. There are other ways to get to the same page, but this is one of the hidden secrets that either you know it or you don't know it at all. So for those who don't know it at all, I thought it'll be a good tip to share this one. And when you're working as part of a large dev team, it's like each person can have your own dev tenant. So it's always good to have your own tenant. I have about 5 different tenants where I configure different things. They're absolutely free. You get about 25 licenses. And the best part is you get a tenant with about 16 users pre-created with all profiles and images and mail and chat channels created and so on. So it has some good sample data packs included in that. And if you keep using your tenant, at least once a quarter, it automatically gets extended. So for example, I have some tenants that I've had for maybe 4 or 5 years, and they're still going. So definitely this is one of the best options for you to use, but you should make sure that you don't really have data that you will really want, because it could get cleared out from time to time. So it's meant to be sort of a developer tenant, but it's fully licensed. It has the E5 license, so everything is activated, all of the features, and it gives you the best of everything. And The things that I'm going to be demoing, like I have my own tenant that I've created. That's an M365 Dev Tenant. But I also have, for example, customized my own domain, added the DNS. I have this mailbox with those users, and I use it for all of my demos. So that's right. So that's the first tip on the Microsoft 365 Developer Tenant. Definitely use that and the sample data, and it gets really useful. The next one is on Graph Explorer itself. I feel like there isn't really much focus on Graph Explorer itself and on how to use Graph Explorer. So I'm just going to go through and cover a few tips. I'll start walking you through those things. Okay, so the first one, if you don't know, the shortest way to get to Graph Explorer is you go to aka.ms/ge, and that's G for Graph Explorer, and you straight away get into the Graph Explorer page. Or this is the one that's my personal favorite, which is ge.cmd.ms, and you can quickly get into Graph Explorer from there. For those who don't know, there is cmd.ms, which has lots of shortcuts to every single portal and page in M365 and when Azure AD. So you don't need to click multiple times to get to where you want to go. You just remember the URL and you can quickly get in there. So this is one of those other tools that I've created for the community. Say, for example, if you want to get to Intune portal, you just say in.cmd.ms, and you'll be logged in and taken straight into the Intune portal. Similar with Azure AD as well. So that's the first tip for Graph Explorer. Just type ge.cmd.ms and you're taken straight into Graph Explorer. Now, for those of you who haven't used Graph Explorer, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a very slim minority of folks that haven't used it. I'll just walk through some of the basics and some of the things you might have missed because Graph Explorer has been there for a long time. You would have just been using maybe about half of the features that exist here. So the first one is, of course, you can type in any URL and you hit run query and it will execute the query and show you the response here. So you get that option to run any Graph API and you get the results here. Now on the left-hand side, you get lots of examples. So all you have to do is, say, for example, say you want to get users, you search for user, you get a list of all the APIs that include user, and you can do things like get me, say my skills, or count the number of users in your tenant. You add that in and you run the query and you can get the result set. Now, the samples are really good because they do things like, I'll cover this later in another tip as well, but if you use some of the special queries like $count or filter, you need to add some special headers. And these samples add the header for you. So it's a really easy way for, getting this in. If not, you need to manually come in and type these parameters that say consistency level and eventual and things like that. So some of these advanced Graph API queries need those headers in place, and these samples add them in. So it's a quick and easy way of adding those in by just going there from the samples. Now, if you didn't know, you can also do edits from Graph Explorer itself. So you can call get, which I guess is what a lot of people use, but you can also do things like post, patch, and even delete. So say, for example, I want to make some change to some of my profile details. I can just come in here, copy, paste that because it's a patch. You only need to put in the things that you do want to change. So I'll just clear out everything else that I don't need. So let me just, do a typo and do a change here. So you change that to a patch and you do a run query. You just see I just added the letter S at the end. You can see in the previous one I don't have. So I run this and the patch went through ahead. It's a 204 that was successful. Now if we do a get, and you run the query, you'll see that it has updated, right? So if I head on over to the portal and search for my name, and this is another tip, if you weren't aware, this search bar on the Azure portal searches across everything. So it will even find users for you. And say, for example, this, I click here and I straight away get into my user profile. So you come in here and you go into properties, you should see that my name has changed on the portal as well, right? So this is a really cool way to remember that you can do patching as well from the Graph Explorer. Right. So a lot of people don't really realize that you can do all these patch and updates from here. Another neat tip is to know that you do have something called the history. Right. So I've seen people copy and paste the same thing over and over again when they don't realize that there's a full-blown history here for 30 days. So you can go back to any sort of query that you had previously. So I click this one, it shows the API that I ran and the results that came through. I can run them again. So you don't need to copy paste things again. So if I want to get back to that edit that I just did before, I just click that and you can see that it brings up, including the stuff that I put in here, right? So it's a really powerful feature there to have the history. And you can sort of run this from here. You can also download this into like a HAR file, and you can open it up on Fiddler. I believe even Postman loves opening these things up. So it gives you a quick way to like move this whole set of things, the queries that you ran into Postman or into one of your other favorite tools. Right. So that's another easy tip there. Okay, so moving on into some more tips about the Graph Explorer is the share button. So you are working with the team and you crafted like a complex URL in the history. Now this one is a simple one, but if I do things like maybe getting a secure score and added some parameters and so on, you have the share button. And you can copy that and share with one of your teammates, and they just get to the same page where you're on with the query typed in as well, right? So very easy way to get someone onto that same context. So you're doing a screen share and you want to hand over to them. This is an easy way to move that across, right? So very powerful there. Next, we get into this tab called the Modify Permissions tab. Now, this is where it's sort of very dynamic in this blade here. So as you type in your query, you'll see this. If I come in here and I go to, say, I want to make a call in admin / say service announcement, you can see this page refreshes and it gets you the list of graph permissions for that particular API. Now, sometimes I don't know if it's my network, but maybe I'll try a simpler one. So say beta/users. So it just took a while to load. So if I go into one of the APIs that I need, you can see it dynamically refreshes based on what I want to pull across, right? So beta/. Sometimes these APIs take a little while to load up, but what happens is it shows you the permissions for that particular component or the API that you're calling. Maybe I'll just try a refresh of this page. Yeah, so for me, you can see that for the me API, it's showing what are the graph permission scopes that are needed. So it's very context sensitive. It's one easy way if you were trying to call into a new API and you're figuring like what permissions do I need. You can go to the docs, but this gives you a really quick view of what permissions are needed. And the neatest thing here is you can do a consent right from within the screen. So you can click consent, and if it's your dev tenant, you're the global admin, you can just grant yourself this permission. You can also remove a specific consent if you want to retry or replay the practicing this. You can just say unconsent to the permission, and it will remove that permission. Right. So sometimes you get this propagation delay thing. So if it's a dev tenant, you want to reset it back to how things were, you'll be able to consent and unconsent this way. If you want to clear all of the consent, so this is another tip that people sometimes might not be aware. If you want to remove all the permissions, you would just want to reset it to how it was when you first created your tenant. Then you will go into the Azure AD portal. You go into the Enterprise Applications blade, and you can search for Graph Explorer, and you can actually delete that. So you can delete the entire app. And you don't need to worry, you can delete the entire app. You go back into the Graph Explorer, you'll be able to reconsent to these permissions. Right, so that's a neat way to sort of, especially with the dev tenant, you want to reset things back to how they were. A quick and easy way to get Graph Explorer back to how it was. Right, so that's with the consent permission. Now, for example, you might not know the API, but you know the permission you want to grant. There's a hidden place here. You might not have seen or known about this. You hit on your profile, then you click on consent to permissions. It opens a full-blown view of all of the permissions, right? So from here, you can just type in, say, directory.read.all, and you can just type in the permission and you can consent to it. So if you ever need to give Graph Explorer a permission like that, you can just come in and you can see which permissions are needed. So that's a neat tip. So these are all like power user tips about Graph Explorer that might be all coming out new to you. Another one that I really like is if you go into a sort of a new API and you're not sure what the API does or how it works, you click through on the more info and you can say learn more. It'll take you straight into the Graph API for that particular, the reference docs for that API. Right? So you don't need to go to Google search or Bing and then search for the API and then come and find it. It's just one click away. So you pick on any API that you want. You come here and you click learn more. You're just taken immediately into the reference docs. So that's a really powerful way of getting into the docs without spending time searching, and then trying to figure out how do you get to that API, because these things are not always really easy to search. Normally you can, give the URL and search, but with some of the more complex ones, especially where you have lists of parameters in, it's a bit more harder. So remember these all, because they're all hidden away, most people don't find them out, right? And we don't really spend time learning Graph Explorer. So I thought it would be really good to cover some of these power user tips. And another thing you might not have realized is when you do this, so let me say groups, right? So I'll just go and go to groups, right? And I run the query, you get this responses here at the bottom. Now, again, these are hidden in the other tab, so you might not really have come across this, but you can do these sort of code snippets, right? And you can see the code snippet straight here in your favorite language, whether it's C# or JavaScript. You get the code samples here. And remember those examples we did before, so I'll go into history and say where I did that patch of my command. So let me bring that up. It's the one that did, I think that has gone past in the history. But say if I come here and do a patch, so we'll do this as a patch and I'll make some changes. Maybe I'll set my name back to what it was. Right, so I do this patch and it does the update. But if you go into the code snippets, you'll see you will get the API for doing that change, right? So you can just copy and paste this, and it has the exact content you provided. Or you want to get the PowerShell version of what you just did, this is a neat way. You already had the code, you just copy that over, and you have a full-blown useful capability there, right? So these languages are expanding. You even get Go and like even C# code. So you don't need to, like, there's a lot you can do just from Graph Explorer itself to get these things. If you are a toolkit user, you can also use like the Graph toolkit controls, which work and show you, how that Graph toolkit will show up and render. So another powerful thing which shows you like the JavaScript and CSS, you can make changes here and see how it works out. So very powerful there. And there's also adaptive card for the APIs. I haven't really set that up or played much with it, but it just shows you, right? These are things that we see every day, but we don't really go and dig into it. But there's a lot of powerful stuff happening here. Right, so one more thing is this access token. So this is really, really helpful. The access token for this graph session, and it includes all of the permission scope. So if you click here, you can copy the token, but if you click on this option here, you can see this is the JOT token for the Graph Explorer app, and you can see all of the scopes and the permissions that have been granted to it. So sometimes, you are blocked from doing things with PowerShell and other things in orgs and so on, but maybe Graph Explorer is allowed. Sometimes Graph Explorer is blocked as well, but you do get this quick token. And if you can use it in a lot of APIs and commands where it might not be apparent, right? So you can do something like you can go even to connect mggraph. You can pass in the access token. So I just copied that access token. I paste that in, and now I'm connected, right? So if you see get mg context, now it's thinking I'm using Graph Explorer and all those permission scopes that were given. I have it now, so I don't need to remember a username, password, do all of the MFA and things. You're in Graph Explorer, you just want to quickly run the same thing. You can in PowerShell, you can just quickly copy the access token. The only thing is the access token is valid for 1 hour. So if you're trying to run some long running script, that might not work if it's going over that 1 hour period. But this is very helpful if you want to quickly use it maybe in your C# code or whatever you are writing, in a dev context. It's using this. So it's a good way to troubleshoot the difference between, if you think something is working in Graph Explorer, not in your other app that maybe you registered, you can just use this to try things out because the token is there. All of the APIs should work, just to make sure that it's nothing to do with your code. And then you can, I sort of use it to isolate where the issue is. The identity protection, if it's coming from the same machine, it might not trigger. But yeah, that's a good call out. Identity protection could find it and it could trigger it. Right? So that's something to remember. So if it's your dev tenant, you can definitely do it your own tenant, right? So it wouldn't affect what anyone's doing. The next one, this was my first tip, but this is a quicker way as well. If you click this option, you will be taken to the dev program URL from where you can join. So you can either Google M365 dev and get to the same page. But if you don't remember that, you can click here in the tenant settings and click on that option to take you straight into that page. Right. Cool. Right, I think I covered all of the tips that I had on Graph Explorer. Yeah, all of that's done. Cool, so I think that hopefully was useful. Next is the Graph API reference docs. Now, these are some tips about using the API reference docs because I know people get sort of thrown out with all of these different things, right? So the first one is I always have my, I'm sort of like a command line guy, and I want to get to where I want to go without having to click multiple times or do searches. So you'll always see me using an ak.ms or some sort of shortcut. So graph ref will get you to the graph reference. So you just type ak.ms/graph ref. You'll be taken to the API for Microsoft Graph, right? So you are quickly into the API. You can drill through the user list, and you just get in there. You don't need to search or bookmark these. You can also switch between V1 and beta quite easily, and that's like when you're writing code, you want to get to something, you can do this. Now, I already shared the tip where you can go straight from Graph Explorer to the particular API from here, but sometimes you don't even know the API. You might have to come here to search and get to that. Right now, one like a really important tip that I use here, which people get lost around with the API, is the API always has this top level with almost all of them on the left-hand side. You get this the main object type listed, and it lists all the methods. Most people skip this page. They think, okay, there's just random stuff there, and you go into the API that you're actually working with, which is like get a list of users or update users. You get this list, but this is actually very useful. So I'll use group as an example. Well, I'll pick that group example in other places. So when you do groups and you say, okay, you want to create a group, now you come here and you look at examples, and it says, okay, so you can pass this into the group as parameters. Now you might think, okay, is that all I can pass into the group? And you're like that doesn't look like what you should be able to do more with the group, right? So the tip here is there's always lots of link here to the actual reference object, right? So if you click on group on that link, or it's usually the top level thing, it takes you to that summary page, which shows you all the methods. Now, this is good, but what I'm always really interested in is properties. Now, this is sort of the hidden secret. When you come to the properties page, you will see every single property that you can pass when you create a group, for example, right? And even better is these options. So all of the parameters that you can pass in for any of these, you get that full list of what you can pass in when you create a group, right? So all these details are included. And let me see, right? So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So say, for example, resource behavior options. Now, what do you pass in? It says string collection. What are the values that you can pass in here? And if you see over here, you will actually get to see a list of all of the actual types. They are usually like magic strings because it's REST API, right? You get to see all the options that are included, and you can pass them over there, right? So this is a very useful page that not a lot of people are aware of, right? And the other most important one, usually you need to query these objects when you're writing Graph API to filter and so on. You get this definitive list of what filters that particular field supports. So you don't need to blindly try different things because not all of them support all of the queries. So if you say, I want to get a list of all the groups where the preferred language is equal to English, by coming here, you'll be able to quickly know, does it even support the equal operator, right? Because various operators are not supported depending on there are lots of things going on behind the scene, and some things are supported, some aren't, right? You can also see, this one supports count not equal to 0. So you can do things like get a list of all the users who don't have a proxy or who have a proxy address. So you can run queries like /count, $count equal to 0, not equal to 0. Yeah, so this filter and these APIs are really powerful. It gives you all of the information that you need, and it's sort of hidden away behind the scenes. And I need to usually guide when I'm working with teams. I need to guide them to how they can get to this page, these pages. So remember, with all of these, you need to remember to get to the resource object. And sometimes some APIs call out the object, so you can see the return type or the object type that you need to pass in for these things. So you can click through on those. Sometimes you need to click through a few different times to get to the actual object and what you can pass in, right? So this is sort of like an app role assignment. You click through here, and then you get to see, okay, what are the IDs? For example, what can you pass in, right? So it gives you much more information, and you can then work out your examples from there, right? So make sure you remember how to do that with the Graph API docs. Another tip with the Graph API doc, if you haven't seen it, or maybe you've seen it but you've never used it, is there's sort of like a mini Graph Explorer built into the docs. So you can try it. Now it only works with sort of the sample data that's included, not with your own data. So you might not get results all of the time, but it just gives you a quick overview of that API and how it works. So if you want, you can then click on, go to the full experience. That will take you into Graph Explorer with the full-blown one, and it includes the API that you are using. So this is something you might have seen but never tried. You can just come straight into here and try that out from there, right? So you click here, you get taken out, but that's a really powerful way to get to the documentation as well. So my main tip for the Graph API is just that. Okay, the other main tip is at the bottom of every page. So if you come across any issue with an API you try, didn't work, or it's not working the way you expected, or you want it to do something different, or maybe you want to contribute, you look at these examples, you got something working which is slightly more complex, you want to add another example to contribute, you can say submit and view feedback for this page. So you can click that. You'll need to sign in. I'll just do this in my other profile, which should be here. So you can say submit feedback for this page, and you'll be taken straight into the Graph API in the docs page, and you can come in and see how you can make that change. So you can request things, right? So you can say there's a bug you found, and you can contribute to this. These are always monitored and triaged by the docs team for those pages. So it's a really good way to give back to the community if you found an issue that you'd like to get fixed and so on. And so that's how you can give back and help out as well. Okay, so that's GraphRef. Remember, ak.ms/GraphRef. Okay, Graph Filter. Now this is something that if you're a dev, you'll be using quite a lot, and even if you're an IT pro, this is something you need all the time, right? You have these objects and you need to query and get results. How do you ak.ms/GraphRef? How do you know what is supported, what's not supported? You try to run some command in Graph API and it's not working. It says this is not supported. You're just getting some random errors thrown at you. So that's where sorry, I used the wrong short link, ak.ms/GraphFilter. So Graph Filter takes you straight to the Graph API page that shares the filter. Now you can also go to GraphRef and scroll down and find the right page, but GraphRef will take you here. The neat thing is it gives you all of the different parameters and options that you can use when you're making a Graph API call. And there are loads and loads of examples here, right? So this is to anything you want to do a get and run queries on any of the Graph objects, whether it's users, groups, devices, whether it's in SharePoint, Teams, almost exactly sort of the identical set of APIs. The only thing is because of how all of our different products are built, the filters and what they support can be different, right? So that's why these docs are important, because they let you see what's possible and what's not. What I really like is this link here. If you go down, you'll be taken to this filter page. But if you come to the advanced capabilities, I don't know if you have seen this before, but you have this neat table that shows you for some of the key Azure Active Directory objects, what filters, what operators are supported, right? So you can see some of these don't support the equal to null or equal count equals 0, or some where you can see this, right? So this gives you a really neat view. You don't need to do any guessing anymore. You can see if a particular object supports something that you're trying to do, whether it's even in the list. So it's a quick way to scan everything. Like you can go and look in the API docs itself, which gives you that information. But this gives it in a neat, nice summary as well. Are there any open questions, Nandeesh?
There's one from Harry which says, how about adding the code snippet to the preview experience directly for easier example access? I think that's more of a comment.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think those sort of suggestions we can always take back to our teams.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Cool. Yeah, so this filter is very powerful. You can do this, and some of these are new. So if you tried some things with Graph maybe a year or two ago and they didn't work, doesn't mean that it still doesn't work anymore, because we keep changing and we keep adding these things. So the one thing with Graph is you can't assume anything. So if it didn't work before, you try doing the same thing, always come back and check, because maybe it's possible now. Right, so there are always improvements being made, and these are not things that are sort of advertised, and you'll need to find them out on your own. Now, one really important thing with all of these are called advanced capabilities, is you need to pass some parameters in, which I showed in Graph Explorer. You need to add this header called eventual, and you need to send that in. Now, you might say, okay, how do I do this in PowerShell? It's confusing. How do you pass this header and so on? So what you can do is always go back to Graph Explorer and say, for example, this earlier example thing that I showed, you run this, it gives you just a number, which is the count. And if you go into your code snippets, you can see how they always had add the header for those things, right? So that makes it really easy to know how that works. So obviously, the generation engine doesn't work too well, so it makes it harder. But say, for example, let's do, I think groups might be simpler. Yeah, so I think that doesn't, but with Graph Explorer, with PowerShell as well, you will need to add the header to do that. And sometimes you need to do the count, right? So there's a $count variable. Maybe, I'm not sure why it's not working, but definitely worked when I tried yesterday. Yeah. So with Graph API, you can add the same headers by using that. Right, so you have the consistency level, and the count is another parameter that you need to sometimes use. Right, so you can see how this works. So if I do this try it option, that might be the faster way. Yeah, and I'll also go into the full experience so we can see that. This works. This works. Right, so but yeah, I think this is sort of, this is auto-generated, so this actually will fail if you run it in PowerShell, because in PowerShell you need to have spaces instead of the plus sign. So you might sometimes need to tweak the PowerShell examples that you get, but these are things we report back to the team that writes these engines, and they fix them as we call them out. right? So the advanced filter is one where I spend a lot of time trying to do things, and it supports OData, so it's very complex and things that you can do there. There are lots of capabilities there. The other tip is there is a training module, which is really good. So if you haven't done it and you work with Graph quite a lot, this training module will take you through lots of things. You'll become an advanced Graph API, especially with OData. You learn quite a lot of ways how you can work with all the different entities and search and how you can perform these various searches. So Graph is like the glue that holds everything together in M365. And if you are M365 dev, definitely an area where it's always good to learn and how you work with these things. Okay, so jumping on to some of the tools that I've created. The first one is Graph X-Ray. This is a browser extension that I've built. So if you go to either ak.ms/graphxray or graphxray.merill.net, or if you just go to merill.net, I have like all of my apps linked in from there. You'll be able to get to your extension. So there is an Edge, a Google Chrome add-on as well. And you can install the extension. Now, once you install it, what it does is any portal or any experience in Azure AD that's calling. So what happens is these portals are also nowadays being built using Microsoft Graph. So the same Graph API that you use is what our first-party Microsoft developers as well use to build all these different portals. Right now, we are modernizing all of our portals, so not everything uses Graph API, but some of the big ones that were rewritten are users and groups, and some of the more common ones. So once you install Graph X-Ray, you get this extension. You need to open your dev tools, so you either press F12 or Command Alt I on a Mac, and you can get to the Graph X-Ray. Now, this is where there's something in Chrome where it doesn't show up all the time, and I need to struggle getting that in. Okay, it's turned on off again. So let me go to AD. Maybe I'll try on a different instance. This one. I should have wanted users. Give me a second. Let's see if at least it works on, yeah, it works on this. Okay. Okay, so once you install the extension, if you come into DevTools, you'll see this Graph X-Ray being listed. Sometimes it takes a while to load with Chrome and Edge have this weird thing with dev extensions. They are blocking something, so it sometimes takes a few more refreshers. Okay, so if I go to the users plate, right, you can see here what happens is every time whatever the browser page you're looking at, when it calls Graph API, Graph X-Ray will start showing you like a stack trace of what's happening behind the scenes on that page, right? So this is an extension like we built for an hackathon that we worked on last year. And the neat thing with this is you can pick your language. So if it's JavaScript and you, like, for example, I'll search for my name. Right, so I pick, say, my object, and you can see the APIs that are running on behind the scene. They all show up, right? So I can go click edit, and you can see it shows up with all of the changes, and you can even do your own updates and hit save, and you'll see the code generated for that, right? So if you want to see the version being generated as PowerShell, you can do that, or you can do this with JavaScript as well, right? So it's a really neat, easy way to like what we did with Graph Explorer, but on this side, you get to see this with just using. Right. So what the usual demo that I like to show is using groups. So if you go into groups and you sort of try to create a new group, right? There's so many different parameters that you can pass into a group, right? So you can say, yes, I want it to be role assignable, or you can say, I want it to be a dynamic user group, and you can create your own dynamic query here. Right, so let's say account enabled equals true, right? So you type that in and you add the expression. Okay, so I go back into so I'll save that, right? So I'll say test group, right? And I even maybe assign an owner, which is I'll give Adele. So once I clear this, and I hit create, you can see it shows the exact, like, all the parameters that I passed in. It will show what I passed them in, right? So, and if you're doing it in PowerShell, sometimes these are really, complex to understand how to craft them. You get a really quick way to see how that was crafted, and you can then just copy and paste that and use that in your Graph PowerShell. Right, so that's very useful. I saw someone like Intune portal is heavily built using Graph API, so almost all the blades work. The thing with this is not all of in Azure AD, not all blades use Graph Explorer. So if you go into some of the things like I think enterprise apps now do, but if you click through into one of these, you might not see much happening. Right, so. But yeah, it looks like apps they've started doing a rewrite. So Graph X-Ray is very useful tool to have in your toolkit. The next one is Graph Permissions Explorer. The Graph Permissions Explorer is actually useful for security folks. So this is where the reason I built that. Someone asked, okay, when I grant directory.read.all, what permissions am I giving someone? Right, so I unfortunately works better with Google. So on a Google search, if I search for say directory.read.write.all, when you search on that, usually this comes up as a second search hit. If someone says, if your security team asks, like, what other things can someone do with those permissions? I created this page which gives you this view of all of the APIs that someone can call by permission. Now, our normal docs gives it the other way around. So it'll give you saying, for this API, this is all you get at the moment. So it's sort of not very easy to understand what when a security, someone is reviewing it and they want to make sure you get only the least privilege, what you can do with that. So this page really helps. So that's the Graph Permission Explorer. You can search and come through Google, which is how a lot of people come to these different pages, or you can even search from here, right? So you can see user.read.all some API. You can get to that particular page, and you can see, all of the different APIs that can be called, and you can then click through to the actual API from there onwards. Now, that page is written by scraping the docs, so it's not 100% accurate, but our internal teams are working on having this built into Graph API, so hopefully we'll get a better list from here. Now you can get to some of this from Graph Permissions Explorer, but this view of all of the permissions is sort of only available with in this sort of new portal at the moment. Graph PowerShell. So Graph PowerShell, this was supposed to be half Graph PowerShell, but I spent a lot of time on all of the others. But I think it was useful anyway, because Graph PowerShell also relies on all of this, right? So you need to know how to move around in the Graph API for you to be able to use Graph PowerShell. So ak.ms/graph PowerShell is sort of like a link tree that I've created to give you all of the main things about Graph PowerShell in sort of one page. So just remember that ak.ms/graph PowerShell. What happened with Azure AD PowerShell and the other PowerShells before it is we had a team that was manually building all of the commandlets, but as people know from history, new APIs will turn up, but the PowerShell will not appear for a long time. Sometimes it took a year, sometimes longer, before the PowerShell commandlets were all available, right? So it was very difficult with some of those things. So what we've done now is the Graph PowerShell and a lot of other libraries like the Go library, even the newer Python one, etc. They all get auto-generated now based on just the API specs. So there's a Graph API, so we don't have people hand crafting and writing these. So you can quickly get through to the Graph PowerShell. There are some other links that to remember as well, apart from the link tree. So this is what I frequently use, which is ak.ms/mgps, which is Microsoft Graph PowerShell, which gets you to the quick page about Graph PowerShell, how to install it, all of the commands that you can do. And the key is this reference. So you get to all of the reference commands. So if you want to get, say, like get mg user and so on, you can quickly look those up from here and get to the page that you need to. Now, some of the important things to remember is if you know your way around Graph API, it's fairly easy now to work out how you can do the PowerShell version of that, right? So there's always a get, post, put, patch. So they have corresponding verbs in PowerShell. So you can easily remember what it is that you need to call by just going through that, right? And then how the API maps to the commandlet name is also really simple. So if you were to look at this, right, and if someone asks you what's the Graph PowerShell version of this, it's usually get mg and then user and message. So if you see here, that's what it maps to. I'll make this bigger, right? So get mg user messages, and it comes into that, right? So that's how you can sort of translate a Graph API call into PowerShell. Now, of course, you can always use that snippet feature now, which is really handy to get to the PowerShell version. But if you know the API, you can easily call this from here. Another tip that a lot of folks don't know or might not realize is, okay, you have the API, but what permission scope do you need, right? So you can use PowerShell itself to sort of figure some of these things out, right? So if you want to call get mg user, but it might throw an error saying you don't have the permission to call that. So we have this find mg command where you can say, okay, for this command, let me say this one, get mg secure score, right? It gives you a list of what are the APIs that are available. Now you need to use this format list option to give you a breakdown. So when you do format list, it gives you a clearer view to say, for this PowerShell command, these are the permissions that you need to use. And it goes from least privilege to the higher privilege. So you can then say, okay, right, that's the permission I need. So now you can say connect mg graph, and you can say scopes, and you can use that scope, pass that in, right? So that gives you a really quick way to get into the Graph API commandlet. And it's a few sort of tips on how to navigate between the different things in Graph API, right? Sometimes the docs fall behind. Just the other day, I found out in the docs, the PowerShell, the API was there, but the PowerShell commandlet was not being generated. So we had this other API called find graph command, and you can give just the URL, say maybe this one, and it gives you the exact commandlet that you would call for that, right? So this is a really useful thing, and this is only exposed through PowerShell. So this is where you know the URL, but the docs also don't show what the PowerShell command is. You can use this to get to the right API, right? So find mggraph. It supports wildcard as well. So this one is an important tip. Use the dot star so you can do a wildcard search, right? So that's a very neat and powerful way to find the right command. Cool. So yeah, so graph, and the last one is sometimes the commandlets might not give what you need. The handcrafted commandlets. You can always do invoke graph request. So if you got it working in Graph Explorer and you know the URL, so you can do things like invoke graph request, and you can run this run some query. So I'm just calling something maybe. I'll just do a simple one, which is invoke graph request, and so let me say, get me graph microsoft.com/v1.0/users, right? So you can do that. Now that's the difference when you call the invoke command, where you can call the raw Graph API. It'll give you like a different object that you need to then pass through to get. It doesn't give the rich object that you get with the commandlet. But sometimes this is the only way to do, especially if you want to do your own paging of the results. You want to have a long PowerShell script that runs, might take hours to run, and you want to page through each result set and do things. Then this is useful here. Right. Yep. So that's what we can do with Graph PowerShell. Okay. So the last tip, we are deprecating Azure AD PowerShell, and we are recommending you move to Graph PowerShell. So both Microsoft Online and Graph PowerShell. Now I know we are not 100% there with all of the commandlets, but we are working. We're almost at 83% now, and we hope to close that entire gap. So if you are someone who has been working with Azure AD PowerShell for a long time, and you have lots of scripts written, you want to upgrade, you go to the same page that I had before, and I call this Graph PS map to get there, but you can also go from the other page. So let's go to ak.ms/graph PS map. We provide this page where we map all of the Azure AD PowerShell commands to the graph. Now you can see we do have gaps, but we have been closing this down. So right now, this is sort of like a full list. It includes all of the Azure AD PowerShell and even the MS Online commandlets. We give you the graph version of these. So this is continuously being improved, and we're asking that you move to this to switch over. Now, it's a little hard to rewrite all your scripts, so which is where Graph PowerShell, why I built Graph PowerShell like a conversion analyzer. So if you have some script, right, say something like this, where you were calling, get Azure AD user and, doing various things. If you wanted to write the PowerShell version of this, let me zoom out, you click, you write, you just copy paste a script in and you hit analyze. This generates and spits out a whole list of the PowerShell commands that you would use now. And it'll take your old code, say something like this, and translate that to the graph version of the API, right? And what I especially like is being able to click through to all of the different links from here, because when you're here, there isn't an easy way to find out what is the Graph API, because the docs in PowerShell are improving, but they're not there yet, especially when it comes to all the different advanced parameters. So there's a quick link to get to the actual API for that commandlet, and then figure out okay, for user object, what are the different parameters that I need to pass in. You can find them from here. So this is a way to sort of help you move and migrate your script over. Awesome. Thanks for the call out, Andy. Yeah. So this is sort of like when I used to be a dev from, a VB dev, and we were moving from VB to C#, there used to be all these nice converters that let you copy paste the code and get the C# version of the code. And that was my inspiration for building this. Now, one of my good friends, Frederick, built PS Migration Advisor, because you can do this for single scripts, but if you have a whole repository of lots of PS1 files, doing that is a lot harder. So you can use this PowerShell commandlet that he built, where it can give you, like, spit it out. It can scan an entire folder of PowerShell scripts and give you the same recommendations, but straight from PowerShell, right? So if you were doing like a bulk migration, that's a really easy way to work across. Cool, awesome. So that about winds down everything I have. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, on Twitter at Merill, and on Mastodon as well, Merill at infosec.exchange. And yeah, I sort of try to post some new tips and tricks on Twitter as well, so it'll be a good way to keep on top of things.
Absolutely. I would definitely encourage you folks to follow Merill. I learn a lot. It has helped me in my projects, so please do a follow there. And you know what? He's going to be a regular guest in this call. I will ensure to book his calendar going forward, because I'm pretty sure he's going to generate a lot of new tips and tricks by 6 months or 3 months or whatever.
Yeah.
So cool. There are a lot of questions in the chat. I've tried to do justice, but then if there are questions that are still not answered, folks, please feel free to come off mute and ask your question. Would be happy to take it up.
And hope you found it useful. Yeah.
I would say, Merill, this is by far, I think I needed an army to manage the comments and all the, it's by far a very popular topic. No two thoughts. I would be not be surprised if we get a lot of views on our YouTube video as well. Yeah,
I was surprised. These tips are not, we have it in the docs, but I didn't find many clips and, at least presentations that covered all this, because Graph Explorer, no one is going to learn all the tips and tricks there, right?
Absolutely.
There's so much in there.
Yeah. Okay, folks, if you have no questions, I mean, we would be probably done for the call. But then, if there are any questions, I would give you one more chance to come off mute or even put it in the chat. We would be happy to take it up.
I have the one in the chat about the permissions for Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Graph PowerShell applications. If you have user consent turned off in your tenant, how in the world do you let people? You can only admin consent for these things. How do you get around that for just these two applications? Because you didn't need this with Azure AD or MS Online PowerShell.
Yes. Yeah.
So and worse off, is it the only way they can consent for these? Application administrator doesn't even allow it. You have to be, I believe, a or a privileged role administrator or a global admin. Two permissions we don't want to give to people. How do you get around it?
Yes,
it's a big problem.
So why we moved away from pre-consenting is basically, like with Azure AD PowerShell, it actually follows it's not really good practice of pre-consenting all permissions to Azure AD PowerShell, for example, right? And we know that, the folks who write, the bad folks, they use that same Azure AD app to do things in tenants. And that's how someone can just run a script and it can do things that are harmful for the tenant. So we tilted more towards the security side on the newer Graph PowerShell, where no permission is pre-consented and your tenant admin has to pre-consent. So they can grant consent. What they can do is they can go to Graph Explorer and limit who the users are. So that's one way we recommend. So they can say, anyone who's a dev in the tenant to do that. Or the best thing I tell is use your own dev tenant, and then you can do everything in there and you don't need that. But what you might a tip for your admins. If you are an admin and you want to allow just some of the folks to be able to do this, what you can do is in the enterprise apps, you can limit it to just the users that need that app. So if you go to enterprise apps, you search for Graph PowerShell or Graph Explorer. So you get both here, right? So this is Graph PowerShell, and then you have Graph Explorer. They can say this particular app needs a user assignment required. They can say yes.
I understand about assigning users to the application, but that doesn't allow them to admin consent for the permission. There's still a problem. They can never add the permissions to the thing. Somebody who is a global admin has to add. So if you do Connect Graph, how do you get past that little permission problem?
Yes, yeah. So there is a shortcut which our team doesn't really try to recommend too much, which is there's a permission called directory.access_as-user.all, right? So that permission, if you give, it sort of consents to almost all of the delegate permissions instead of one by one, but we normally try to recommend not using that. So this is one exemption where so then you don't need to give, at a per, the delegate permission, you don't need to grant each one. That one sort of gives access to almost all of the delegate APIs. So that's a shortcut. It's not an official recommendation. You won't see us writing it anywhere and saying to do that. But the other ways for the global admin to sort of go in and consent to the different permissions that the person needs. So that's the drawback with tilting a little bit more towards the security side. And usually what we recommend is all devs to have their own Dev Tenant where they can, grant all of this, and it takes away that requirement.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. We have gone off time, but then a last check if you have any questions for us. Okay, I see a question. What's the approach we should take to find Graph API endpoint for any use case other than docs? For example, update M365 group properties. There's a question, Merill. The question is, from
other than docs, so we obviously will always recommend the docs because that's where we put in a lot of effort, and it's where the dev teams, the PMs who build the features, they go in and, put in all the content there. So we try to make that the source of truth. And if you see any gaps in those or mistakes, please use that link at the bottom where it says report an issue and submit there. If something's not clear, just give your feedback because our content writers and those teams are always looking to improve this. And we want that to be the one-stop place that everyone gets to, right? We don't want to have lots of different destinations. So there's a lot of effort being put in there with actual content writers and the PM teams and others involved there. If something works in Graph Explorer, but you get an error when running the command, what might the issue be? So Rob, that's a good question. And I don't know if you missed that tip. So one way to sort of work around that is in Graph Explorer, you have the access token. So I recommended copying that access token, using that in PowerShell, and then running it. So then you can work out, you can sort of try to isolate. Is it an issue with permissions or is it an issue with PowerShell? Because sometimes crafting it in PowerShell, those JSON and things, they're a bit tricky, converting a JSON call into PowerShell. So you can use the access token to remove all of the headaches about permissions and just clear out your PowerShell script. Once you get that working, then you can sort of troubleshoot what the app permission is. So the tip there for you is on how to sort of navigate and work through that.
Okay, I guess if there are any follow-up questions, I would appreciate if you could email us because I think we have shot 15 minutes off the time and I'm sure the questions would continue. So you guys know us, we are on LinkedIn, you have our email IDs. If not, I'm going to put my email ID. Shoot out your questions. I would be happy to take it up to Merill and I'll get it answered. But thanks a lot, Merill, for joining at this odd time and such a popular topic. And you did a great job, not just with your tools, even the session. Thanks
Awesome.
a lot.
Yeah,
Guys, you need to fill in the feedback for us. This was a great session. I am going to also fill the feedback. So please take some time and fill in the feedback for us. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining the call.
Cheers.
Thank you, Merill. You have a great
folks.
rest
Have
of the
a great
day.
day. Yes, bye.